Sometimes, as he paced his tent with furious energy, Pomponius Falco would come to a sudden halt and, probing about the region of his heart, exclaim that such pounding was a warning signal of his grievous mental distress, and he repeatedly questioned the wisdom of taking a sedative, an opiate or a purge, I know not which, to rescue my analytical powers. They are torn to shreds by this abominable wind. Who can think in this? It was as if the desert itself had chosen to reflect his mood. For the wind that had risen during the night had increased with every hour, until now even the morning sun was lost in blowing sand. His tent shuddered in spasms of compliance to the wind, and the sound within was an all-pervading thrumming which Falco announced would soon drive him mad. "It is absurd enough to be awakened every morning by a rhapsody on Silva's ridiculous trumpets," he whined. "But now the gods must conspire to add the beating of 1,000 drums. I am now thoroughly convinced the Roman army cannot do the slightest thing without tooting on their childish tubas whenever something begins, and then tooting again whenever it supposedly ends. Little wonder our soldiers are such tedious bores." Falco addressed this immediate resentment to Albinus, who crouched warily near the tent entrance, and to Cornelius Tertullus, who was poised on Falco's couch, belly down and feet in the air. Occasionally, when Falco's eyes fell upon him, he would move his legs slowly back and forth as if they were swimming under water. The movement was approximately as Falco had prescribed. Cornelius was being punished for his table manners. "You naughty boy," Falco had said earlier, "I will teach you to break wind while I'm breaking my fast. For the rest of this entire morning you will be a mermaid." Falco had then boxed Cornelius's ears until he wept, and now, if he stopped swimming for long, he would kick him with enough force to make him gasp in pain. Now, 4 days after his arrival at Masada, Falco was beginning to question the wisdom of his coming. What a wretched experience! Only a reward of great treasure could equate the situation, he thought. Only an honor so great he hardly dared dream about it could compensate him for the danger. Discomfort and embarrassment he had known since leaving Rome. Pomponius Falco, named by his emperor, Ver Clarissimus, most illustrious man. This morning, with the whole world become a howling bowl of hot wind and stinging sand, Falco found a masochistic pleasure in reviewing certain unpleasantries which had befallen him since he had first conceived the idea of coming to Palestine. There had been, first of all, his failure to establish a profitable relationship with Caenis, Vespasian's iron-willed concubine. It had been doubly disappointing because working through women had hitherto always been easy. "I have," he had often reminded himself, "a very great and natural talent for it. We are sympathetic. The girls trust me, the little dears. They find me refreshing after the apes they are obliged to take as lovers. They do not care that I was born beneath the tiles. They recognize ability and legitimate ambition, because they observe it every day in their very own mirrors." Thus had Bernice been approached originally and enlisted as an influential friend, and many others. Unfortunately, not even Bernice held an approximation of Caenis's power. After all, who in the entire Roman Empire was closer to the emperor? Now Falco remembered how Caenis had been cold and uninterested, and had even cut their meeting short when he had complimented her taste in maternity gowns. Indeed, Nero had known what he was doing. All pregnant women should be kicked in the stomach, as he had so wisely done to his dear Pompeia. Suddenly Falco began to tiptoe about the tent, holding a finger vertically above his head and eyeing Albinus and Cornelius with elaborate invitation. All women are brood cows. I bid you remember that. They are thus little trouble if kept constantly with child, but in time this reproductive action becomes a bore to the initiating man, and he takes his penis elsewhere. The truly enlightened, of course, discover the ecstasies of sodomy, and once persuaded, purify themselves forever by forsaking all relations with loathsome females. Falco clasped his hands as he waited for the impact of his words to dissipate. When neither Cornelius nor Albinus displayed the slightest reaction, he forgot what he had said and became lost in brooding upon the indifferent attitude and deliberate slights imposed on him by Flavius Silva. The beast, he thought bitterly, that disfigured, crippled mastiff, that drunken, whoring, bastard son of a Mars, had not as yet had the courtesy to invite his official guest to sup with him. His reply to your plea for provisions, since your own were now exhausted, had been to send down the standard Roman army fare, a disgusting porridge made of pulse, soup, bread, lard, and a hint of vinegar, and some scrawny bits of vegetable to thicken the mess. It was uneatable, and the wine he had sent from what he had claimed was a personal supply was a perfect match. "It makes me fart just to look at it," Cornelius had complained, which had only caused Falco to strike him again. Ah, how he longed for a respectable meal, to ease his gastronomic distress, and divert his thoughts, at least temporarily, from the wind. Falco reviewed a banquet he had once attended at the home of a senator, a true commissar, who also appreciated pretty boys. It had been intimate and deliciously obscene, with only 9 honored guests. This was in the height of fashion, being neither less than the number of graces, nor more than the number of muses. The first of the 20 courses served on the lemonwood table proved to be ram's testicles temptingly clung from candles shaped like a phallus. There followed such a profusion of delicacies, Falco could now only remember a few. There were piles of the celebrated Lucrine oysters, encircled by wings of tiny thrushes. Then, for contrast, bear paws from Germany, marinated in a pepper sauce, followed by pigeon eggs, artistically set in the gelatin which adheres to the upper shell of the turtle. Then followed a course of trout from Cisalpine Gaul, exhibited to the guest, prior to cooking, in their traveling habit of still frozen glacial ice. And while the cooking of the trout proceeded, there were plates of crisp sea wife and mushrooms to nibble on, along with great bowls of beer to stimulate the kidneys. Eventually, When the trout had been consumed, there arrived sausages inserted into the wombs of young sows to bridge the highly emotional gap betwixt fish and meat. Then there had come the wine, an exquisite concubine that would have pleased even Horace, had been alive to test its flavor. Had he been alive. And at last a gigantic flaming pie was carried into the midst of the coaches by 9 beautiful boys, each of whom laughingly chose a guest as his partner for the evening, and from then on served him as if the poor man had lost the use of his hands. Out of the pie the boys plucked deer hearts from Spain and roebuck from Gaul, boar tongues from the marshes of Belgica, and succulent strips of gazelle from Africa. Falco tried to recall further exotic treats that had graced the pie, but he could only be sure there had been some badger hams said to have been sent down from England, and some wafers of lion liver, rationed 1 to each guest. Vivamus dum licet esse bene. Alas, it now seemed so long ago. He paused in his pacing and looked down at Cornelius, who was still effecting a swimming movement. But his eyes were closed as if he were trying to absent himself from the tent. Falco puckered his lips and then kicked him. "There, Miss Mermaid," he said, "you just struck a rock. I suggest you keep your eyes open for the rest of your voyage." And looking beyond him, he saw Albinus wince, which pleased him. What dull young men! If either of them would fight back, at least they might be more interesting. Of course, they would never dare with that bevy of Usipots and Batavians on guard outside. At least, Titus had provided an escort which was impressive. They might not be cannibals, but they certainly looked it, and even most of the legionaries gave them a wide berth in passing. But then they stank like hyenas, so no one cared to make their close acquaintance. "Now hear me, both of you bitches," Falco began in a high voice to compete with the drumming wind. "My nerves are very much on edge this morning. Wind always upsets me, and I will not be teased though you festoon your groins with flowers. I'm concerned only with the fact that we are at least temporarily at the mercy of that relic of all wars, that hostile, one-eyed, stumbling, marching oaf, General Flavius Silva. Now I will tell you this. I did not come this far simply to inhale the desert atmosphere, much less be driven nearly out of my wits by a Hebrew wind, nor do I fancy being insulted by military minds, or worse, ignored. I embarked on this enterprise with the intention of making some history, and that I still propose to do." Falco strode to the tent entrance and pulled back the flaps just far enough to admit a blast of sand. He closed the gap instantly and grunted his disgust. "I shall begin by personally exercising the right of damnatio memoriae on our friend Silva. By the time I have washed my hands of him, Vespasian will at best request him to fall on his own sword, or send him off to the farthest wilds of Britain for the rest of his marching days. Nothing he has ever done will be remembered, and his name will invoke no recognition whatever." Falco strode over to Cornelius and said, "You may stop swimming now. I find it distracting." "Can I sit up?" "Yes, but if you commit any further vulgarities, I shall have you permanently corked." Falco resumed his pacing, trying to organize his thoughts against the persistent assaults of the wind. All successful actions are the result of meticulous attention to detail, he reminded himself, and now was the time for an examination of present opportunities. Alertness, ability to shift quickly to the latest development, was the true mark of an expert in political life. Opportunity were the new and perhaps unrecognized opportunities here? Silva? How can that wretch be forced to serve the aims of Pomponius Falco? Answer? First return to the basics and review exactly what had originally inspired this particular expedition. It had appeared simple enough when viewed from afar. You, Pomponius Falco, were clever enough to perceive how Roman blood was being diluted in the hybrid ocean of her new subjects. Vespasian alone had added enormous areas to the empire, and the administration of those provinces was delegated to an ever-thinning supply of the educated and capable. The numerical strength of the aristocratic Roman families was constantly diminishing, and had been for years, while the slaves and all their ilk were becoming ever more fertile. Who, then, but a blind man would fail to see how they were becoming masters in fact, if not in name, and would soon take over their sterile superiors' powers that they had already bastardized his culture. There were many blind men in Rome. It seemed to be a deliberately acquired escape of the high-born and influential. And where did this all leave such as one as Pomponius Falco, who was not blind to events and trends, and who is in former times might at best hope for some obscure appointment in the government agency? In a very special position, thank you. It had only been necessary to move discreetly when in public, and be careful about taking on airs long considered the privilege of the equestrian class. Roman knights were competition for the time being, but they were anachronisms, whether they knew it or not. So tolerate them a little longer, as you might an ailing relative still undecided about an heir. Their arrogance now makes little difference, because you, Pomponius Falco, will one day sit in judgment on them and remind them of their behavior, how they had never seen fit to suggest a certain former occupant of an attic in Ravenna join their circle, no matter how assiduously he had applied himself toward achieving an education. Any Roman great or little knew that it took a man of exceptional talent and energy to change his status during a lifetime. So, it had already been accomplished. After all, Vespasian himself was declared in writing you are known at court, but what that darling of manhood who looks more like a bath attendant does not realize is how very much further you intend to go. Nor does his son Titus, that mentally defective pretty boy with a perpetual erection. Did it ever occur to you, Albinus, that Vespasian could be seriously constipated? He has the faraway look. I have never seen the emperor, nor has he ever seen me, my dear Albinus, and I would not depend on Titus recognizing me without a strong assist from an aide. That is the genius of females when employed as prods to the mighty. Without spilling a drop of blood or spending a sesterce, they can cause a man to authorize actions he would not otherwise dream of permitting. We have merely ventured a first step. Within a year, I guarantee you, both Vespasian and Titus will have cause to recognize me. Why? Asked Cornelius accusingly. But Falco was too far lost in speculation to notice his pouting tone. Because, my dear. I intend to earn his attention by being the first to arrive in Rome with an eyewitness report of ultimate victory in Judea. Silva will be so occupied cleaning up the mess he has made, it will be weeks before he can even start for home. I'm even now preparing for my reception at court with my letters to a female. She, being privy to a forthcoming event, will be unable to contain the secret. Hence, with proper timing, everyone will be waiting breathlessly for my arrival. News, the first news made palatable, is the key. To what? Asked Cornelius. You make up a lot of lies, and then listen, and perhaps reward you a few thousand sesterces, and out the door you go. My stepfather is one of those people, and I know how they behave. Falco wheeled on Cornelius and raised his hand threateningly. Stop pouting, you little bitch! I know what I'm doing. I have no intention of bowing out the door with the mare, thank you. Heroes are the first to arrive home from wars. All others, who dribble back even a few weeks later, may have been as brave as lions, but they are ignored. I intend to make a specific request of Vespasian after appealing to his passion for economy. He has recently created new provinces, Achaia, Lycia, and Rhodes, to name a few. There are also Byzantium and Samalis, dreary places, I suppose, but potential treasures for a Roman governor with a sense of financial acumen. Falco picked up a mirror and thoughtfully began to preen his locks. He made faces in the mirror, pursing his lips and elevating his eyebrows as he talked. Each of these new provinces will require a governor. For one of them, the ideal choice is myself. Suppose by the time we return to Rome governors have already been appointed, Cornelius asked. Then I will accept some higher station in the imperial bureau, and soon enough find cause to replace one of the appointees. For a moment his thoughts drifted far from ambition. Wetting and working his lips, and studying his image in the mirror, he suddenly found himself wondering what it would be like to make love with a circumcised Jew. Dear, dear, what a mad idea! This wind is making you an eccentric. Only one matter need concern us at the moment, he continued. General Silva, who has so taxed my patience. Every man has his measure of sophism, and our dear general can be no exception. Yet my institution tells me we would be pursuing a false spoor if we accept the obvious and suppose that wine is his major temptation. Still lost in the mirror, Falco pressed gingerly at the skin eruptions scattered across his cheeks. Let us better suppose that Silva is as illogical as most men who are cursed with an overabundance of masculinity. As a consequence, he joins the ranks of innumerable foolish men who are susceptible to even sillier females, and in the process become as vulnerable as mating doves. Silva himself has drawn the picture for us by consorting with this Jewess Sheva. And since he did not discard her after first lust, indeed we know he has seen her repeatedly, we must acknowledge she has some influence upon him. How much or how little must be determined. It therefore behooves us to concentrate upon her for the time being, discover what she wants from Silva, since all women want something in return for their odoriferous carcasses. If we cannot better or sooner fulfill that desire, then we must explore other means to make her our friend. We must know her future plans and present movements about this camp. When we are sufficiently informed as to her background, and particularly her relations with Silva, then I will find cause to invite her to this tent, and from the moment of her arrival you may be sure Silva will no longer be his own master." Albinus, seeking favor, said, "I know the tent where her family lives. I heard them speak in Greek, so perhaps I could become acquainted." Falco snapped his fingers and smiled at Albinus. "Go, my dear boy, go. Wrap your face carefully, lest the sand blemish your skin." The gale swept northward from the parched Nabatean hills, gathering heat from the wilderness of Zin and force from the Gulf of Aqaba. It scorched all that lay before it in the long Wadi Arabia, creating a chain of vast dust devils as it spewed into the valley of Salt. Soon this great wind became pinched between the rusted iron mountains of Moab on the east of the Dead Sea, and the wild Judean hills to the west, so that in the region of Masada it became a tempest. It sucked at the breath of men, both Jew and Roman alike, until the desert itself seemed to quiver beneath their feet. The sun, which had ever been a merciless white, became an orb of cinnabar, and along the exposed flanks of Masada even the shade rattled in the heavier gusts. Occasionally torn rags of clouds combined with racing blankets of dust to obscure the sun entirely, and then all men moved through a lurid twilight, which some believed heralded the end of the world. Silva thought it fitting that his mount should bear the name Fury. Certainly it matched the temper of the morning. He had bought the horse in Libya, home of the only good mounts in the empire, with the possible exception of Sicily. Fury was a splendid conformation, a typical Libyan bay with the white star on his forehead. But somewhere in his training a mistake had been made. While the beast behaved with admirable courage during actual combat, he would, in peaceful surroundings, shy at a passing butterfly. As a consequence, Silva had himself initiated some good-natured ribbing when the subject of his horse arose. Fury, he had often said to his officers, should have been a mare, since his behavior bore no relation whatever to his name, and he was frivolous and undependable as a very young girl. There had been many times when Silva had resolved to be rid of Fury, and yet, as if the beast sensed his intention, he would then behave as if Silva were his only god and his sole mission on earth was to please his master. Now, on this terrible morning, Fury proceeded warily through the camps, head down, against the wind, snorting fiercely as if to call Silva's attention to how bravely he was meeting the ordeal. At Silva's side rode the centurion Rosianus Gemenus, who was prefect of the camp, was duly bound to do what he could to alleviate the wind's devastation. Because of the storm, Silva had accused the balance of his staff from this morning's tour, and instead of walking, as was his custom, had ordered Fury brought to his tent. Now he questioned the wisdom of his choice, for he worried about the effect of the stinging sand on the horse's eyes. Silva had covered his own face with a band of silk, which he had cut from a toga Livia had bought him long ago, and which he had flatly refused to wear in public. "Am I a peacock?" he had asked her, Must I strut about in this gaudy flimsy just to be in fashion? Supposing a wing comes up and lifts it on high, then will Romans observe not the splendor of a peacock's fan, but the blushing butt of a very embarrassed general? This morning, at least, a piece of the toga was serving some useful purpose, after being packed around for years, and he thought ruefully that if Livia were alive this morning and asked him to wear the toga, he would have agreed instantly. So much for regrets, he warned himself. There were enough discouragements at hand without reviving old ones. Half of the tents in the camp were collapsed, and some had been blown completely over the wall and disappeared into the dust haze. Morning drill and reports had been cancelled, as the legionaries were told to seek what shelter they could find. Final work on the assault machinery had stopped, and the now abandoned mobile catapults looked like the skeletons of primeval monsters, rising out of the haze. Work on the main assault tower had also been stopped. It swayed and creaked so in response to the heavier gusts. Silva wondered if the whole structure would be blown over. Everywhere there was great confusion, and the few men Silva saw actually moving about passed like invalid ghosts through eerie spumes of sand. He had progressed very slowly, because at times they could see no further than their horses' ears. Masada itself had been obliterated since before dawn, and they found their way to the base of the ramp only by plodding straight into the wind. Silva's crimson cloak stood straight out behind him, the collar choking his neck. His mouth and nostrils were dry with dust, despite the silk mask, and the hissing of the sand against his helmet seemed to constantly remind him that Masada must be conquered very soon, or perhaps it might never be done. At last they came into the northern lee of the ramp, where they found the tribune Gallus, more morose and detached than ever, though his lips were cracked and his face caked with sweat and dust, and his eyes tormented. Silva was not in the least surprised to find Gallus at his post. Gallus was going to build his ramp regardless of the gods' indisposition. It was his ramp, and it might be blown away today, but if so, he would commence building tomorrow. "Hail, good Gallus," Silva began. "How is your liver this bright and bracing morning? Have you forgotten I promised you fresh cool air and maidens 2 days after you give me a ramp?" "I have trouble, sire. I have had trouble since last night, when the Jews decided to kill their own." "I was informed of your skirmish. You lost 9 Jews and 4 of your own men. I believe 1 more legionary will die before the day has passed. When he has expired, and weather is clear enough to see from Masada, kill 2 Jews. Be sure the execution is witnessed from the summit." Gallus wiped at his watering eyes. "I need every man, sire. I need hands to build, not to die. Even my best Decurions cannot make the Jews work productively in this wind. Have you told them they have never been safer? Nothing can be seen from Masada, even if an arrow could fly across this wind." "The basic trouble is more serious, sire. Since last night's killings, I have almost 500 men who refuse duty on the ramp." "You are speaking of Jews?" "No, sire, legionaries." Silva was puzzled. For a moment he thought the wind had tricked his hearing. He asked incredulously, "Your centurions have ordered legionaries to work, and they have refused?" "They complain they have had enough of Masada and the desert. They say we will all soon die on the heat, and they see no reason for it. If it had not been for the coming of this wind, I believe there would be more than 1,000 now. The word goes quickly from tent to tent. No word travels unless some man carries it. Who is the ringleader?" "Apparently there are several, but I know of only 2. A Decurion whose name is Fronto. I remember him as a troublemaker in Africa. And there is Valens, who is a Hastatus of the 2nd century. I believe there are many more. If I know but one, that is enough. I'll gild the lot of them. My information is they were inspired by one Ezra, one of the Jews who came down to us. Silva turned to Rosianus Geminus. Bring the men to my tent within the hour, and bring the Jew. As Geminus rode off, Silva remounted. He said to Gallus, Carry on as best you can, my friend, as if nothing was awry. I suspect this thing has been brewing for some time, and did not just blossom with the opportune arrival of a pervasive Jew. We are drawing too many of our legionaries through levy. You say to a 17-year-old, you are drafted, and fail to tell him why, and at once you have the seeds of mutiny. It is not the boys, sire. They serve well enough for the most part. They send us too many foreigners these days, and most of them have never been to Italy, let alone seen Rome. Gallus looked away and grumbled. I have never liked the use of mercenaries. They brought the downfall of our republic. Silva deliberately cut him short. You are very outspoken this morning, friend Gallus. Some of our princes, dead or alive, might take exception to your views. I care not, sire. Mercenaries bring more mischief than they are worth. They always have, and they always will. For a moment, Silva thought to ease his sense of having been subtly chided by putting Gallus in his place. He had suddenly presumed a great deal upon their friendship. How dare an engineer, in this case a man who was a civilian at heart, presume to even hint at criticism of the Roman military? Was a man of Gallus's intelligence unaware of the dangers to the empire of the savages to be found in every direction from Rome, waiting to pounce upon the only home of civilized man? Suddenly his resentment subsided. In the first place, there was no little truth in what Gallus had said, and second, he could see no farther than his ramp or whatever he was building at the moment, for which devotion any dependent commander should be grateful. Silva bent down to the neck of his horse, so that his face was nearly level with Gallus's. Good Gallus, your spirit is sore from lack of rest. Take this miserable day, when so little can be accomplished in spite of your will, and make a journey. Then tomorrow return refreshed to your obsession. You know it is impossible for me to leave. Is it? Come to my tent, and I will lend you some Seneca. Or do you prefer something lighter? I would then recommend a rather strange book called Satyricon, if you have not already seen it. Satyricon. Very good, tongue-in-cheek Petronius. While I approve of neither author, I will admit both men are capable of instantly transporting one from Judea. You're kind, sire. I am grateful. Or if you insist on improving your mind, I have Ptolemaeus on astronomy and Frontinus on aqueducts, which I refuse to show you, lest you become diverted from your present work and try to bring water to the desert. I have all the poets, from Ovid to Lucan. You have simply to name your choice. The sudden vision of Gallus's dolorous countenance, absorbed in Ovid, with his great nose sweeping back and forth along the lines, delighted Silva. How he longed for the close companionship of a man such as Gallus. Perhaps some day, when Judea was only a memory, he would visit the house in Praeneste. I will come as soon as I am certain all things are in order, sire. And that will be never, thought Silva. He touched his helmet, pulled the silk up to his eyes, and turned away. Well, he had tried. Now, with the wind at his back, Silva found the return ride to the camp comfortable enough to concentrate upon new problems. As for possible mutineers, he found he was more dismayed than chagrined that there might be serious discontent in his command. If it proved to be serious, then he would know how to handle it. Regulations of the Roman army actually left the commander little choice. More disturbing was this storm, which was not only delaying the ramp, but must also postpone the project that had suddenly become his own obsession. The more he considered it, the more he became convinced that a meeting with Eleazar ben Yair just might result in a complete capitulation of the Jews. May the gods encourage it. Yet Sheva cannot climb the mountain in this wind, no matter how easy her escape is made to be. And now, what has to be done about Sheva? Perhaps I should try some of the old cures my father told me about. How did one go? Wear a crown of herbs adorned with the rind of linden tree to avoid intoxication. Make a sacrifice to the god Fascinus to ward off feminine enchantment. Simple enough, although the legionaries might have some cause to mutiny if they observed their general wandering about camp wearing a crown of herbs. Well then, what are you, Flavius Silva, general of the armies, governor of Judea, and friend of Titus, last of the Cornelii, master of an empty, half-finished house in Praeneste, what are you going to do about this recalcitrant Jewess? And will you now be so bold as to envision your relationship 10 years hence? Consider the Ides of May and the festival of Lemuria, when in ancient times they used to throw 30 old men into the Tiber from the Sublician bridge. Now, of course, they only throw images made of rushes, but the implication is still there. 10 years, 20 years hence? Would Sheva secretly wish to push you into the Tiber every 13th of May? Silva passed a group of legionaries, huddled in the lee of the camp forum, where a low earthwork had been laid to better serve as a marketplace. They were playing knucklebones, and Silva was reassured to see among them Calpurnius Silex, the soldier he had so often accused of plotting to own the 10th Legion. Silex would gamble on anything should the odds be attractive, even to the possibility of the sun not rising, and here, even with the elements screeching around them, he and his comrades managed to indulge their true passion. Although Silex ranked only as a decurion, he was still a very privileged soldier, since he was also an evocades, one of the select class of hardy campaigners who had long ago served out their time, yet had chosen to re-enlist. Therefore, there were no drudge duties for Calpurnius Silex, even if his proven loyalty to the imperial standard were not enough excuse. His resourcefulness would have found a way out of any unpleasant assignment. When Silva beckoned to him, he immediately dropped the jacks and came jogging to Fury's side. "Well now, cunning Silex, how fares the richest man in the Roman army?" Silex returned his smile of appreciation by revealing the broken files of his surviving teeth. The majority have been lost in some long ago affray. He glanced back over his shoulder and said in his lilting Calabrian accent, "Those who are born fools, sire, are not worth the trouble to instruct." Ah, And the fact that you are plucking those innocent pigeons, who are also your comrades in arms, never leaves you with bad dreams. Nightmares are for losers, sire. I'm trying to build a house, Silva said dryly. The government is now lending money to qualified Romans at 12%. That is more than I can afford, and I have been wondering if I might do better business with you. For generals, I have a special rate, sire. How does 11.5% strike you? Both men, enjoying the exchange, burst into laughter. Then Silva bent to rest his arm on Fury's neck. Careful now, he thought. Silex has never known anything but the army, yet he is still a peasant. Twice a day he eats his porridge and drinks his pasca with men of his own kind. His first loyalty is to them. The heartiness had left Silva's voice when he said, I hear there are fools other than clumsy gamblers in our camp. Their eyes met, and Silva knew Silex exactly understood him. There are some who would listen to Jews, sire. Would one bear the name Fronto and perhaps another Valens? You know more than I do, sire. Silva believed him. He asked, What is there? Discontent? Silex hesitated, then seemed to reach a reluctant decision. You, sire. It is the same old story. If the weather is bad, blame the general. How many are involved? I do not know, sire. Silex bit his lips and seemed to find something of great interest on the ground. Looking down at the top of his helmet, Silva saw it shake almost imperceptibly. His voice became firmer. Make a guess, old comrade, and it had better be a fairly accurate guess, or you will soon find yourself in farthest Armenia, gaming with auxiliaries who I understand have no money at all. Silva reached out and knocked sharply on Silex's helmet as if it were a door. Come now, is your brain clearing? The trouble is mostly in the third cohort, sire, then some too in the second, and a maniple here and there in the first. Altogether, I would guess there might be 1,000 men. You will be pleased to know, Silex, that your usual arithmetical accuracy has been confirmed by another. Now return to your jacks, and if you are questioned about our conversation by your friends, I advise you, for your own sake, to say they were discussing the ratio of water to vinegar in your pasca. Silva rode away and passed between the lines of rattling tents that bordered the Principia. He came to the tribunal where normally he would administer rewards and punishments. It was obviously impossible to hold any sort of audience on the exposed platform in such weather, and for a moment he debated postponing his inquiry until the morrow. Then he decided against any delay. The disease is already in their veins, he thought, and if I give it another day and a night to nurse on our infections, the result may be fatal. He reined Fury to a stop and looked down the slope that supported the lower half of the camp. Most of the leather tents were lost in the blowing sand, and not a single legionary was to be seen. He knew the tents of the cavalry stood in the middle of the mirk, and on both sides of the mounted troops would be the tents of the Triarii, the Principals, and Hastati. Then beyond them, almost invisible, would be the tents of the Syrian and Arab bowmen, auxiliaries deliberately separated from the legionaries, lest their often characteristic disloyalties infect good Romans. In each tent lived 10 men with their petty officer. And this morning, he thought, they are hiding from more than just the wind. Shielding his good eye with the palm of his hand, Silva looked up at the whirling wall of sand that totally obscured Masada, and he muttered aloud, "Jew, you have won this day, and perhaps you will win again tomorrow, but the next day must be mine." As always, the centurion Rosianus Geminus had done his job with speed and diligence. He had brought the Jew called Ezra to Silva's tent, and a Pharisee known as Zidon, who claimed to be the leader of those descended from Masada. As Prefectus Castorum, Geminus had called upon Silva's own Praetorian guards for assistance, and had also brought the 5 legionaries, said to have sparked the fire of mutiny among their comrades. Now, with their wrists bound in heavy thongs, they stood just inside the entrance to the tent. Behind them were twice the number of Praetorians, and in front of them, appearing perplexed and very out of place, stood the Jews. As befits the occasion, Silva thought. Looking over the assembly, he suddenly realized how every man in the tent shared a common appearance. They were all powdered with the gray sand dust of the desert. Silva lounged at ease in his ivory and mahogany chair. Apos had brought a stool for his bad leg, and he moved his foot slowly back and forth as the Greek surgeon had directed. While he exercised his limb, he deliberately ignored all those who had entered his tent. Finally, impatience, combined with pain, made him raise his eyes and acknowledge the presence of others. He summoned Ezra and Zidon to approach him, and when they obeyed, he surveyed them in silence, as if they were a species of human entirely new to him. Keeping his eyes fixed on Ezra, he reached down to massage his leg and asked, "Do you speak Latin or Greek?" "Both." "So, then you are a Jew of some education." Ezra bowed his head for a moment and appeared lost in meditation. "If you are debating whether to answer any of my questions instantly," Silva growled, "I recommend you reach an affirmative decision now. Otherwise, my annoyance with you may result in your instant and permanent silence." Ezra folded his hands behind him and looked up at the peak of the tent. "You have a gap in your tent, General, just at that pole." "I know that." "You are trying my patience, Jew." Silva was as angry with himself as with Ezra. He had completely forgotten to tell Geminus about the careless rigging of his tent. How could he have the soldier responsible whipped when the word would soon be out that a Jew had discovered it? "I'm not deliberately avoiding your question, General, only seeking the true answer. You ask me if I am educated. Who knows what an educated man is? My brain has been enriched with the logic of Aristotle, yet I know not how to milk a goat. I am acquainted with the science of Euclid, yet I cannot find a well or sail a vessel. I am familiar with Platonic philosophy, but I cannot build anything durable. Obviously, I am an ignorant man." "You sound like a man whose head is his belly and has eaten too much," Silva interrupted. "I have also studied rhetoric under the famous Nicetas Sacerdos of Smyrna." Silva smiled in recognition and interrupted again. "Who should have quoted one of your better Hebrew recommendations? As I remember it, proclaims the most dangerous of organs is the tongue, which is the reason it is hidden behind a double wall, first the teeth and then the cheeks. It is an admonition you seem to have forgotten." The general has also been a student. Ezra nodded, and the two men stared at each other in silence. And your companion? Silva asked at last. Is he also too clever for his own welfare? Can he speak except to make trouble? I have made no trouble, sire, Zidon said in a voice that was barely audible above the rumble of the wind. I am a man of peace, and my people are dedicated to peace. We have come down of our own desire to ask your mercy. In other words, you want to live, Silva said. He sighed and for the moment became fascinated watching the tick-work of the side of Zidon's face. It must be a nuisance, he thought, because at one moment it would subside and then unpredictably become violently active again. The Jew must be constantly waiting for the next spasm. Silva had already decided Zidon was a born conniver. Look at him now, he thought. See how his eyes are alert to your every movement and expression. Terror draining the very blood from his face. In contrast, observe the other Jew, the one called Ezra. He stands there as if he owned the very earth beneath his feet, which of course in a sense he does, but he is still standing in my tent. Watch him. There is a worthy man, and a wise one, and a brave one. It would seem, Silva said easily, that one or both of you have been abusing our hospitality. I do not understand you, sire, Zidon said. You have been fathering a multitude of lies. Silva glanced over his shoulder at Epos, his Numidian. He signaled him to kneel beside the chair. Then he grasped Epos's head and turned his face toward the Jews. He pulled open his mouth to expose the stump of his tongue and said evenly, Who knows? At one time this man might also have been eloquent. I bought him after he had made a mistake. He used his tongue to make trouble for a Roman. Do you think you deserve any better treatment? Silva released Epos with an affectionate slap on his bare back. He is a good man, and now he always tells the truth. I urge you to do the same. I am informed how you have abused our tolerance by spreading false rumors among your guards, and they, being ignorant of your true intentions, have passed this nonsense on to their comrades. As so often happens when rumors are cunningly sweetened, some soldiers will swallow the bait and turn lies into fact. 5 of my legionaries, who will soon regret their gullibility, stand behind you. I want you to tell me now exactly what you told them. Ezra answered quickly. Too much so for my pleasure, Silva mused. The man has come prepared. Ezra said, I have told no lies, General, but I have made certain prophecies, and they will transpire. Assume you are a qualified soothsayer, in all of whom, including our Roman variety, I have little faith. What were these words of such import? If you do not wish to believe we Jews are endowed with special powers, I will ask the general to remember Vespasian and a certain Rabbi Ben Zakkai. I believe the general was present at Jerusalem when the rabbi prophesied Vespasian would soon be emperor. And it was so, was it not? And Vespasian himself recognized the rabbi's powers and remembered his promise to allow him an academy of learning. And that school is this very day functioning in the town of Jabneh. It stands as a monument of proof that when a Jew makes a prophecy, it is well to believe it. Vespasian, Silva thought, would believe anything. It seemed that every time he paused for a breath in a foreign land, some native found opportunity to predict he would soon be wearing the purple. Prophets are more likely to be perceptive than endowed, Silva said. I recall some Jewish sage prophesying Jerusalem would fall. He made his prediction after we had besieged it for 3 years, and even a blind donkey could see what would happen. As for prophets, there was one yelling from every housetop in Judea before we came, and each one led you into more trouble. Are you then just another Messiah? No, General, Ezra said quietly, but I am a believer in God. God? Who is he? The Ethiopians make their gods black and broad-nosed, the Thracians like theirs with red hair and blue eyes. Silva found he was beginning to enjoy himself. It was a day lost to the storm, and he might as well pass the time teasing Jews before he decided their fate. Show me this picture. Show me his statue. Show me your God. The laws will not permit his image to be carved or drawn. What laws? Roman laws? We are a tolerant people and have never forbidden you to have your God. But we do not intend you to use him as an excuse for insurrection. What is the matter with you Jews? On the one hand, you appear to be intelligent, and on the other, hopelessly stupid. What is so wrong about Jupiter or Apollo, the perfect symbol of youth and beauty? What is unworthy about Venus, or Cybele, or Diana, or even Bacchus? And there is also Mars, Ezra said. Some divinity is required for war. The God of the Jews does not believe in war. Ho! Silva shouted, and slapped the arm of his chair. You people have been warring among yourselves since the beginning of time. I have made some study of your innumerable sects, and I find the easiest way to tell one from another is to realize you all disagree in what you believe. You who are Sadducees oppose the Pharisees, and you who are Essenes have an even different opinion entirely. You are all specialists in anarchy, and I can prove it. Tell me, he asked while pointing his finger at Ezra, of what sect are you? I am a Sadducee. And you, with this sniveling manner, what is your name again? Zidon. And your sect? I am a Pharisee. Very well, then. I will pose you both a question. Do you believe in immortality? Of course. God has willed it, said Zidon. The uncertainty in his voice convinced Silva the man would betray anything or anyone to save his skin. Here was no Essene or Christian such as he had seen under similar circumstances. They were tough as buzzards. And you there, Ezra, do you believe the same? Ezra hesitated, then answered so softly he could barely be heard. No, General, I do not. Silva smacked the palms of his hands together. There you are. Even on the most basic matters, you Jews cannot agree. How can you deny your people need our guidance? God is our guide, Ezra said. Indeed. Indeed, this mysterious God who chooses to remain invisible dictates his will from no one seems to know where, and you obey like sheep, and you cannot tell me a single thing that he has done to your benefit? Oh, I know of you Jews, better than you think. You slay a ram to ridicule Hammon, and because the Egyptians worship the ox, you choose it for sacrifice. All of you were at one time leprous, a gift of your generous God, as reward for your innumerable mischiefs. But you blame some poor pig for the curse, and have abstained from the taste of swine ever since. How childlike, and yet how subtle you are! To indulge your natural laziness, you take a rest every 7th day, proclaiming it variously as a time of worship, or, I am informed, when that excuse fails to convince, you mumble something about the flight of the god Adea, or when the explanation of your indolence collapses, you pretend to celebrate the movements of the planets, said to be in multiples of 7. Really, how even your glib tongues can persuade others to swallow such preposterous drivel is past my understanding. I pity you, and all you may fall under your scheming influence. Looking at you now reminds me of another confused Jew who was an admitted troublemaker. I cannot remember his Jewish name, but he took the Roman name of Paul, and he was also a soothsayer of sorts, and forever raving about one Joshua or Christus, who seemed to have usurped the power from your previous God. Neither one seemed to help this fellow Paul very much at his execution, which I happened to witness. Silva was surprised to notice a hint of a smile playing about Ezra's mouth when he heard him say, "The man you are speaking of, General, was known to Jews as Saul of Tarsus. May I remind you that he also had a bad eye and a bad leg?" Silva rose from his chair and took a menacing step towards Ezra. He could feel the blood pounding to his face, and his hand reached instinctively towards Ezra, the smirking Jew who had dared so casually to mention the infirmities of his master. His voice became an agonized groan when he finally said, "Jew, I will crucify you head down." For a moment, his heavy breathing was audible even among the rumbling of the wind. Ezra did not move, nor did his eyes show the slightest fear, nor did he for an instant shift them from Silva's face. Finally, he said, as if commenting on a possible change of weather, "It is of little concern to me which barbarous way you choose to kill me, General. The result will be the same, and will only once again prove the constancy of Roman mercy. Yet before you silence this voice forever, I will promise you this. Even if you exterminate every Jew in this desert and every Jew in Palestine, Judaism will survive long after you yourself are dust. You may cut the flowers, but you will never destroy the vine." Silva stood feet apart, motionless, his good eye fixed on Ezra. Now, instead of his animal-like panting, he seemed not to breathe at all. A multitude of sweat globules had formed across his brow, and several joined together to become a droplet which fell to his cheek and slid slowly around beneath his chin. He found that he was trembling. Yet when he made an effort at control, he discovered that his hands were perfectly steady. Then he realized the troubling was inside. The sensation, combined with a knotting in his intestines, had suddenly become so painful he instinctively bent forward. And suddenly he thought, "It is I who am the accused. The eyes of this Jew are killing me. He is not afraid." Silva moved backward, very slowly, until he felt the chair behind him. And he was grateful for it because now a dizziness had come upon him, and he vowed that he would never again so give way to anger. He heard Ezra say, as if he stood at a great distance, "There is an old Hebrew proverb, General, which states that the best way to know a man is to join him in a drink, or do business with him, or watch him when he is angry." And then Silva heard him think, if he was married, and unbelievably, he heard himself answer that he was not, and Ezra's voice then echoed his own tongue when he replied that he was in that case very sorry for the general, since all Jews, whatever their sect, believed marriage and the family were the basic foundations of life. If you depart this life without fathering a son, then you die. If you have one, then you only fall asleep. It was as if Ezra's voice came from a very great distance, so remote that Silva tipped back his head and closed his eyes and reviewed those doubts that had so long haunted him. In the twilight, behind his tightly closed lids, he saw himself attending the worship of Sybil, and he heard again the high wailing voices of the eunuch priest. He remembered how he had enjoyed the pageantry, but had left the service without any sense of satisfaction. The same had been true of his attendance upon the god Mithras, who particularly favored soldiers. He had submitted to a bath in the flood of a freshly killed bull, which the Mithrathic priest claimed would guarantee his being reborn. But he had not believed them. At Livia's request, he had even experimented with the fashionable god Isis, but found the white-robed Egyptian priest with their tinkling sistrums too artificial for his taste. And besides, he had never liked Egyptians. Ezra's voice was still remote, but steady and assured. The world is sustained by three things: by the law, by worship, and by charity. Silva opened his eyes, the bad one as far as he could manage, and he stared at Ezra. By all the gods, Roman or otherwise, he thought, I must go home soon, for every day I am slipping further into the depths of disbelief in everything. I listened to the droning voice of this fanatic as if he were a true oracle. I let him go on and on spinning his lies without restraint or even objection, and now he is interweaving talk of his God with prophecies of our death from the heat, telling me in his impeccable Greek how our bones will melt 10 days hence, and all of this even I am half believing. Silva held out his hand to still Ezra's melodious voice. Enough, Drew, he said. You drown me in words, and apparently, to put an end to them, I must put an end to you. Zidon said quickly, but the promise of Vespasian? We were promised amnesty. Those who came down with you will enjoy it. As for you, Silva reached for the sand glass on the table and turned it over. You, Ezra, and you, Zidon, both of you Jewish birth, are accused of treachery against and interference with the lawful government of Judea. The penalty is death. When the sand has exchanged itself in this glass, your execution will proceed. He saw Zidon twist his hands together and began to sob, but he could not detect the slightest change about Ezra. He seemed to be merely preoccupied. Did you hear me? You, who are called Ezra? Yes, General, I heard you. Silva found himself wishing Ezra would beg for mercy, or if nothing else, defy him. How could a man accept his death so carelessly? I suppose your God will look after you, Silva asked impulsively. He had been right the first time. The man was not only a fanatic, but quite mad. I was not conferring with God, General. Past experience with Roman reasonableness persuaded me to make all my devotions before I entered this tent. Actually, I was thinking of Sulla, the charioteer, and wondering if I should meet him in eternity, how I would best phrase my compliments on his skill and daring. There was a time when I lived in Rome and I made a tidy fortune wagering on Sulla, and I have always felt that I owe him a great deal, not only financially, but as an inspiring example of total contempt for catastrophe. Did you ever see him race, General? As well ask a flame if it had ever seen a lamp, Silva thought. Did a leper ever hear a bell? If there was one single thing he regretted about all his years of campaigning, it was missing the races. He had groaned audibly when he had learned the circus had been destroyed in the Neronian fire of 64, for it meant he would be denied the special sense of guilt only to be found in using the imperial post to transmit his wagers. After careful consideration of all factors involved, he would solemnly dispatch his instructions to the former legionary who occupied a stall adjacent to the circus and dealt in such matters. Bet 1,000 sesterces on the white if Paulinus is the driver. Make it 2,000 sesterces if the red is Clemens holds the reins. As for the controversial Sulla, he was ever the favorite of those tempted by the long chance. He drove every race as if he were racing against time rather than other men. Though he might be far in the lead, He would continue to urge his horses at wild speeds all the way to the finish. Other drivers, more concerned with their lives than for hysterical applause, often held back, waiting for Sulla to kill himself on the final seventh circuit, which one day he succeeded in doing. Somehow there had been formed a mysterious bond among those who risked their money on his daring, perhaps, thought Silva, because they were labeled fools by so many others. Until his death there was no known cure for Sulla fever, and ever since coming to Palestine, Silva had been unhappily aware that Sulla's name meant nothing to his officers. There was not a true devotee among them, and their pretense of interest only revealed their ignorance. It was, he had long ago decided, so discouraging. He had not spoken of racing in over a year. Now here was a Jew, and a condemned criminal at that, who had suffered the same exhilarating affliction. Silva yearned to question Ezra farther. Had he been present the day Sulla was so hopelessly boxed behind two drivers who had vowed to thwart him, and had Ezra appreciated how he had conserved the strength of his horses until the seventh circuit, and had then maneuvered to the extreme outside of the course, thrown the reins in the air, and, oblivious to speed on the turns, whipped his frenzied mounts to victory. Did you see that, old Jew? Was there ever a sight like it? And were you also witness to Sulla's win against the vaunted Greek, Cassander? Remember, Sulla was only a week recovered from a spectacular crash, and his horses were much the inferior beast. Yet when he saw a victory pending for Cassander, do you remember how he had deliberately smashed his chariot against the Greeks, and how once again he had been carried from the track? How Silva found himself wondering, can I execute a man who also believed in Sulla? You are indeed an unscrupulous liar, if you claim to have made money on Sulla, he muttered. Not always, General, that is true, but always in my heart I received more than fair value. Silva hummed briefly, because he could find no other way to express his mixed emotions. All anger had left him as suddenly as it had come, and now he was lost in memories of the circus. How he longed to review those tense moments of crisis and triumph, still so brilliant in his mind, with another man who truly understood. The Jew is right, he thought. I too received more than a fair return. Silva rose and thoughtfully circled his chair. He placed his hands on the back of it and let it bear his weight for a moment. The chair squeaked, and he could almost feel Zidon's frightened eyes watching him. The man was a nuisance, and should be gotten rid of. Yet how to justify killing one Jew and sparing the other, who was probably the guiltier of the pair? He left the chair and limped towards Ezra. He halted directly in front of him and looked into his quiet eyes, where he saw resignation, yet still no fear. And he thought, if I kill this man, then a little piece of myself will die, because here in all of Judea are perhaps the only eyes other than my own that have actually seen and appreciated Sulla. I have changed my mind, Silva said slowly. Since you predict we are all going to die anyway, I see no reason to trouble my soldiers with your disposal. He beckoned to Rosianus Gemenis, who came quickly to stand before him. Take these Jews to the ramp and remove all of their followers from their present comfortable area. All are to be treated the same, both men and women. See that they are put to work in the same manner as the other Jews. He turned his back on Ezra before the temptation to discuss Sulla and the races in general became irresistible. What kind of authority is this? He thought. I cannot even discuss the races with the only other man in Palestine who knew them well. He listened to the wind, taking time to compose himself, for now he must face quite different eyes, and there must be no second softening of his judgment. Finally he turned to look at the 5 legionaries, who had been brought forward to stand where the Jews had the surname of but one Vespilo, a soldier of the third cohort. They were all obviously very worried, ironically, Silva thought, far more than any Ezra the Jew. They had been stripped of their weapons and armor, and their hands were bound behind them. "Which one of you is Fronto?" he snapped. Fronto kept his eyes on the rug beneath his feet. "I, sire," he murmured. "You are a decurion, or were." Fronto nodded, but kept his silence. "Then you know the penalty of your offense, and you should have informed the others, or did you bother?" Fronto pressed his lips tightly together. After a moment, Valerius Valens said, "I did not ask him to come to my tent, sire. I tried to discourage." Silva cut him short. His rising voice became strident. "It will not save your precious skin to pawn your betrayal of the 10th. You have each taken an oath on your birthdays and the calends of January. You have vowed to serve the emperor and the standard of the legion, and by rejecting those promises, you have disgraced us all." Silva was well aware that his own Praetorians were watching him and listening to his every word. Very good. He wanted their full attention, so they would recount his reactions to the rest of the camp, and by the gods, they were going to have some harsh reports to bear. He could, if he pleased, exact the ultimate punishment for mutiny by choosing decimatio for each cohort, which these scum served. Every 10th man, regardless of his involvement, would be put to death. Yet times were changing, and while decimatio may have succeeded in putting down mutinies in the past, it would not do if only because the situation here was so unique. Where else had the enemy been able to look down upon every move of the Roman army unit as if they were watching a perpetual show? How delighted Eleazar ben Yair would be at the spectacle of Romans killing at least 55 of their comrades. Silva wiped the moisture from his upper lip with the back of his hand and said, "I should have you flayed and then beheaded with your own swords. But such punishment is too good for you. It denotes a military death, and some relative of yours may twist the facts to please his honor, and relate how you died in battle. So I shall make very certain your status is understood by every true soldier at Masada. As soon as this wind has passed, you are to be stripped naked, taken to the gates of this camp, and turned into the desert without food or water. Before you are set free, you will be circumcised. Perhaps then, if you meet any Jews in the wilderness, they will be merciful enough to kill you."